Thanks, Will. Our second speaker is Dan Markel, speaking about retributive justice and the demands of democratic citizenship.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you very much to Nick and to Eugene and to Todd and all of my co-panelists, as well as to the wonderful folks at the Federalist Society who have been so exceedingly generous to me over this last year. It's an honor to be here and share some thoughts with you about this big project that I've been working on this last year. It's unfortunately an incredibly and exceedingly long piece, and unfortunately Eugene got tasked with reading about the 130 pages of it. So it's probably going to become the basis of a book, and I look forward to getting your thoughts about it. And let me just sort of give you a few of the bullet points of the argument, and then if you have questions or want to follow up later, you can find me and or download the paper on SSRN. So the paper is about the tissue connecting democratic citizenship with retributive justice. And the argument is that contrary to some of the leading criminal law theorists like Michael Moore or Doug Cusack, who insist that in order for the criminal law to be retributively just, it has to be predicated on moral wrongdoing, I argue that we need to, or that we can, as retributivists, loosen up on the criminalization question and move beyond the insistence on moral wrongdoing as a prerequisite for justifying retributive punishment, at least in liberal democracies. And that qualification of at least in liberal democracies is really quite important. In addition to the thesis that there's more flexibility in terms of what plausibly justifies retributive punishment than simply the existence of evidence of moral wrongdoing, I also argue that retributivists have to show some respect for democratic lawmaking when it applies to sentencing, but the sentencing issue is distinct from the criminalization question. And if I'm right that there is some kind of way in which democratic authority can generate new moral obligations for citizens, then there are at least some counterintuitive implications that arise, and I'll tell you what they are. So first, it seems to me that as a matter of moral obligation, which is to say non-prudential reasoning, we are morally obligated to obey not only laws that seem quite obviously correct, mala in se laws that are obviously liberalism compatible, laws that would ban, say, rape or murder or robbery, but also what I call dumb but not illiberal laws. And that said, there are actually two kinds of laws that we are not morally obligated to treat as an independent reason for action. Those laws which are spectacularly dumb, as opposed to the permissibly dumb, and those laws which are illiberal. Now, if I'm right that there's more leeway for democracies in sort of carving out a space of what might be called the permissibly dumb laws that might bind us in criminal, vis-a-vis the criminal law, then there's a slightly peculiar upshot of that when we think about this from a comparative perspective about what regimes are able to do. And that's to say that within liberal democracies, I argue that that the scope of conduct that's legitimately criminalized and justly punished is larger than what would be justly punished in bad or wicked regimes that are not liberal democracies. So that's the sort of the core thesis. Now, I don't plan on sort of showing you much of the scaffolding behind those claims, but I'm happy to sort of at least cash out a few of those with some examples so that you can get a better sense of where my thoughts are. So one of the things that I had been working on, I guess I've been working in the realm of punishment theory for the last dozen years or so. And I've always been one of these punishment theorists who, rather than focuses simply on the moral question, also looks at the political theory issues associated with punishment as a state institution. Now, what I hadn't done before is sort of give a whole excursus, I guess, on or extended disquisition on sort of what is the nature of our political obligations. And so the first part of this very lengthy project is to sort of go in and sort of see to what extent democratic authority can really change our moral obligations to the law. And so I end up weighing in with against the sort of trendy move in the literature to be a philosophical anarchist, and I sort of throw my lot in with, for the most part, with the folks who Scott Shapiro is one of them, and in the philosophy world, people like Cristiano, people who are sort of skeptical of this philosophical anarchist tradition. But although I believe that there is something to be said about the nature of democratic authority, I do think that there are obvious limits on its ability to create new moral obligations for us as individuals, as citizens. And so the issue is not so much whether there's a content-independent moral obligation to conform to the law, because I don't really think it makes sense to think about moral obligations as ever being content-independent. But the question is, what scope of the content is likely to trigger a moral obligation and what scope is not? And so what I try and do is use these ideas of like what counts as permissibly dumb but not a liberal to versus a liberal versus spectacularly dumb, to try and sort of draw some categories about what kinds of laws might fit in. And I'll just, so in parts 2 of the paper, I sort of say, well, here's what I think from a political retributivist perspective as opposed to a moral retributivist perspective. Here's what I think the potential for us to, what would count as a legitimate criminal law, we could count as the things that the negative legal moralists would think are important. The folks like Moore and Husak say like, well, we got to focus on moral wrongdoing only. I think that's a perfectly legitimate and usually quite attractive approach to thinking about the criminal law, but I don't see why a liberally constrained social welfare approach to thinking about harm reduction would necessarily be in tension with a retributive justification for punishment. Now, I realize that that seems somewhat peculiar to people, but I hope the paper is able to flesh out that intuition a little more clearly. So let me give you some examples of what I think fall under these kind of labels that I've been using. So murder, for example, is a kind of law that I think everyone agrees on. It would count as a necessary feature of any criminal law to be just. You'd have to have a law like that. There's an interesting question about drug possession, gun possession, possession of burglar's tools, right? So these are all things which are not in the language of my interlocutors, folks like Moore and Husak, which the possession of which is itself morally wrongful, right? The question is that those are often sort of risky or thought to be somewhat risky in terms of their likelihood to endanger other folks. And so my view is that that would fall under the realm of, they could be smart laws, they might not be smart laws in terms of whether they are effectively going to diminish these kinds of risks. But my view is that for the most part, prohibitions on the possession of those kinds of things, burglars, tools, guns, or drugs, would fall within the realm of the permissibly dumb. Whereas something like a prohibition on chess, right, at all time, for which there would really be no way you could offer the grounds of what I would call like it's a tweaked version of rational basis with bite scrutiny. A prohibition on chess, a criminal law that would ban chess, strikes me as lacking any possible rationale. Now, the drugs, guns, and burglars tools, so the moral retributivists would say, well, those are all not really morally wrongful. We shouldn't have criminal laws condemning that behavior. You can have regulation. And I try to explain why the regulation approach is, probably preferable, but nonetheless not something that is required at the exclusion of the criminal law from weighing in on some of those things. And then there's other examples that I go to, such like eating on the subway, right? That's here we are in DC, where eating on the subway has at times led to people being criminally liable. And I argue that that would actually also fit within the permissibly dumb, but it's not spectacularly dumb. And so those are my intuitions, and I try and flesh out what their significance is. But the fact that something is permissibly dumb is only the beginning of the inquiry, right? So it might be the case that what we need to do in terms of sentencing is look at whether something passes a rational basis with bite scrutiny, as I call it, in order to warrant a very, very light penalty. But if you wanted to impose a more substantial penalty, I argue that we should actually have, the moral equivalent of a tiered approach, such that the more punishment you wanted to impose on someone for a particular kind of conduct, the more intense the scrutiny we owe as citizens or as officials to the underlying prohibition. So it seems to me that drug possession itself could be plausibly criminalized under this approach, but it would not be something that could trigger substantial punishment. Thanks. On the other hand, theft or rape or murder, right? Those would be the kinds of things that I think could withstand even the moral equivalent of strict scrutiny. And so more intense punishments like incarceration would be appropriate. Now, I do think that there still needs to be some second approach in addition to this kind of tiered scrutiny approach. There needs to still be some kind of compatibility with what I think of as good retributive values. But as I try and articulate in the paper, there's got to be a little bit more play in the joints for democracies than I think retributivists have been willing to acknowledge in the past with respect to these kinds of sentencing questions, as well as the criminalization questions. So the last point I'll sort of circle back to, something I alluded to at the beginning, which is not only what our obligations are as citizens in terms of whether we have obligations to conform to these laws, but also whether we have obligations to assist law enforcement, or whether as officials we have permissions or pro tanto obligations to enforce the permissibly dumb laws. So my argument in the paper is that if a law is permissibly dumb, but not illiberal, then that creates what philosophers call a pro tanto reason for you to enforce it if you're an official. Now, it can be easily canceled or overwhelmed by other considerations, but the fact that there is a law on the books within a liberal democracy that satisfies the kind of preconditions of inclusion in the political process, in those cases, I think that there's a good argument available for thinking that more discretion to officials is not actually appropriate in all sorts of instances. And similarly, even with permissibly dumb but not illiberal laws as citizens, I think we have certain moral obligations to render what I call reasonable assistance to law enforcement when we see violations of those permissibly dumb laws. Now, again, those are pro tanto reasons. They can be kind of overwhelmed under the circumstances, but I do think that the fact of there being a law within a liberal democracy changes what our moral obligations might be, at least with respect to the permissibly dumb. Now, so that's kind of the conservative. I guess I've always wondered why the Federalist Society has been supporting my work, but I think there is a quasi-conservative aspect to this paper as well as a very radical aspect. And the conservative aspect is that it seems that there's a whole range of laws to which we owe some kind of conformity to the law and reason to help out with law enforcement. On the other hand, if you sort of have good reason for thinking the law is illiberal or spectacularly dumb, it actually forces you to act in some ways in contravention to the law when you would otherwise be required to act illiberally towards someone or with a spectacularly dumb basis, which is to say with a totally unreasonable basis. So I'll stop there because I've already gone on, but I'm happy to answer questions later, and hopefully this will provoke some conversation. Thanks.
I want to thank Will and Dan very much for the very interesting papers. I have some comments, mostly addressed to Dan, but let me begin with ones to Will. I liked your paper a lot. I thought it was very interesting and helpful and clear and well-reasoned.